When Vesuvius erupted in AD 79, it totally obliterated the ancient town of Pompeii. It was a hugely violent eruption, and the pyroclastic surges and flows ripped through the town, killing all the inhabitants who hadn't abandoned their homes and fled for safety in the early hours of the eruption. Excavations of the site began formally from the mid-18th century, but it's such a large site that there are still new areas of the town being uncovered today. When we think about the Stones of Pompeii, there are stories to be told from the houses, the public buildings, even the stepping stones in the streets. All of these can add up to reveal a detailed picture of the lives of the people who lived there almost 2,000 years ago. But in order to be able to tell tales of specific individuals and their families, I think we have to turn to the evidence of words inscribed on stone. So in the next 35 minutes, I'll look at different types of inscriptions from Pompeii and what they reveal about politics, religion, and society, focusing upon 4 different families. Many visitors, when they go to Pompeii, don't appreciate that inscriptions are what help us to re-people the towns with real characters. And there's a tendency to separate off Latin inscriptions in daunting great big volumes, untranslated for the general public. And so there's a bit of a linguistic challenge as well in actually understanding even what the stones have to tell us. In the lecture, what I want to do is to share some of the individual life stories of the people who lived and died in the town. And I want to end with the very latest discovery of one man's life story inscribed upon his grand tomb, which has only just been excavated outside the Stabian Gate, and how he contributed to the well-being of the people of Pompeii, helping to enhance their lives in good times and bad. So I want to start with a statue. If we only had the statue itself, what could we deduce about the individual being depicted? So this is a statue that used to stand outside the Stabian Baths. It's now in Naples Museum, and so you can see I've had to use an archive photograph for the original location. It shows us a mature male figure in military dress with his tunic, his breastplate, and his cloak. When the statue was first uncovered in 1853, colour was still visible upon the white marble. So he had a white tunic which was edged with yellow. He had a red cloak and his shoes were black. The tree trunk supporting the statue was green, and his hair, his irises and his eyebrows were also coloured in. He is depicted wearing the sandals of a senator, and the design of his breastplate imitates nothing less than the famous cult statue of the god Mars the Avenger at Rome. So from the statue itself, this all suggests that he must have been a really important member of the elite of Pompeii. Happily, we also have the inscription on the base of the statue, and this confirms some of our deductions and reveals his identity. So the inscription reads, "To Marcus Holconius Rufus, son of Marcus, military tribune by popular demand, duumvir with judicial power 5 times, quinquennial twice, priest of Augustus Caesar, and patron of the colony." So you can see immediately the emphasis on his military role, both in the overall character of the statue and in the very first post mentioned on the inscription. But in fact, he never actually saw a day's battle in his life. The role of military tribune was entirely an honorific position. His importance to the town of Pompeii is confirmed by the fact that he was chief magistrate, or duumvir, 5 times, and this is exceptional in what we know of the history of the town. He was also priest of the Emperor Augustus and patron of the colony, and in that role, he would have been entrusted with protecting the interests of the town of Pompeii at Rome. The inscription also very handily confirms what we might have thought about the chronology, namely that this is a man from the Augustan period, so the early 1st century AD, end of the 1st century BC. But intriguingly, what the inscription questions is he wasn't a senator, despite the fact that he's depicted wearing the sandals that only senators are allowed to wear. He's actually usurping that as part of his image. And also the fact that he's imitating even the cult statue of one of Rome's most powerful deities. Again, both of these indicate his ambition and his sort of chutzpah. Other inscriptions fill in detail about how Horconius Rufus had been an influential figure in politics and society at Rome during around 20 BC down to AD 10. As a magistrate, he'd modified the sanctuary of Apollo by the Forum as joint chief magistrate of the town, along with Gnaeus Ignatius Postumus, and they together carried out work delegated to them by the town council. So they'd been in charge of overseeing the spending of public money and alterations to the religious sanctuary. He also was involved in paying for the redesign of the theatre, and he overhauled the structure of the theatre in important ways, increasing its seating capacity to allow for more social segregation by adding some additional new seating areas. So he added boxes, labelled number 7 here, and the whole area, number 6, is an additional area of seating for the lower classes who were now able to be segregated when they went to watch the games in the theatre. And the reason for doing this was that at Rome, the Emperor Augustus had recently passed legislation dictating that in future, people attending shows at the theatre should be socially segregated by their seating. But in order to do this, Marcus Horconius Rufus must have laid out a huge personal fortune investing in the public buildings of the town. His prominence also benefited other members of his family. We find a Horconia as a public priestess, who's perhaps his daughter, and a Horconius Celer, as you can see from the slide, is named alongside Rufus as benefactor of the theatre, and this may be his son or perhaps a younger brother. So from these inscriptions, we can trace one individual's political career and his contribution to public life. By combining inscriptions with the statue, we can form an impression of an ambitious, wealthy individual whose contribution to the town helped other members of his family gain public prominence too. It's an example of a magisterial career enabling an individual to gain influence in the city. But what of the women of Pompeii, who after all were totally excluded ever from being a magistrate? How can we try to work out what role they played in public life? You know, they couldn't even vote in elections. So I want now to look at a second statue. Here we have a woman depicted modestly and wealthily, and also ideally. This is a sort of ancient equivalent of airbrushing the image. It's a picture of idealized, symmetrical, classical beauty. As you can see, she's also a redhead, which gives everyone hope. She also is very modestly dressed, covered from head to toe. The fact that she has her tunic pulled over her head also alludes to the fact that she would have been performing rituals as a public priestess. Alongside this statue, we also then have a very short inscription on the base of the statue, revealing that the statue has actually been set up by the fullers, who were the sort of cloth merchants of Pompeii. And the statue itself was found in the rear corridor of a huge building paid for and built by Eumachia herself. You can see the scale of it. It's by far the largest building to abut the Pompeian Forum. We know that this building itself was built by Eumachia herself because we have the remains of an inscription very prominently in huge lettering along the portico in the front of the building, and then fortunately a copy of it entirely preserved over the rear entrance, showing that Eumachia has paid for it in her own name and that of her son, Numistus Fronto. But note too that she dedicates it in honor of Augustan concord and piety. And it's thought that in doing this, she is emulating the wife of Augustus, the Empress Livia. Livia at Rome had had a portico built in her name by her husband Augustus in 7 BC. And then within the portico, Livia herself had dedicated a shrine of Concord. So the same deity as is honored by Eumachia at Pompeii. And in Livia's way, Concord is all about celebrating her harmonious and long-lasting marriage to Augustus, but also the idea of concord within Roman society more generally. Some people have even suggested that there are similarities between the two buildings in their architectural design. We only know about the portico of Livia, as you can see on your right, from a fragmentary marble plan, and you can see that there are some similarities in as much as we have a large courtyard surrounded by a portico. But I don't think I'd want to push this analogy too far. I think instead what we have is the way in which Eumachia is inspired by Livia, but not slavishly copying her. And instead she's picking up ideas from the imperial family at Rome and developing them in her own way. So overall, the evidence relating to Eumachia tells a tale of the new prominence of women in public life at both Rome and in Italian towns. And this was the result largely of Rome's civil wars, which brought enormous disruption to Roman society, as many men were forced into exile or even executed or killed in battle. And as a result of this, women then had new prominence in public life at Rome, largely also through the model of imperial women like Livia. Eumachia at Pompeii was using her wealth to promote herself, yes, but also her son, new mistress Fronto. And it's interesting, there's no mention of a husband. So one wonders whether actually the husband is deceased by this point. You can see also how Eumachia herself is deliberately alluding to changes in society and religion in the capital at Rome, aligning herself with Augustus and Livia. And she derives prestige for herself by inviting a comparison between her position at Pompeii and that of Livia, the wife of Augustus, in Rome. I don't have a statue to start the third section. Instead, I have an epitaph. This is the epitaph of an individual called Umbricius Scaurus, who, as you can see, had a distinguished public career and served as chief magistrate of Pompeii, being honoured when he died by the local town council. They vote money towards his funeral and also vote that a statue of him depicted on horseback should be set up in the forum. What's unusual about this particular family is that we can actually pinpoint the source of the family's wealth. In this case, the rather unglamorous product of fish sauce or garum. So Pliny the Elder, who wrote the natural history at the time that Pompeii was buried by Vesuvius, he describes garum or fish sauce as another type of choice fluid called garum, produced from the guts of fish and anything else that would have been discarded, steeped in salt. In other words, it is the fermentation of decaying matter. I'm not quite sure I would call it a choice fluid myself. And he singles out Pompeii as being famous for producing high-quality fish sauce. The popularity of garum is shown on the ground by the discovery of jars of garum in the layers sealed by the eruption in 79. And you can see, even in this case, inside the jar, the remains of the fish scales and the bones that would have been part of the fish sauce. Many of these jars bear painted inscriptions showing that they were produced in a garum factory owned by Umbricius Scaurus. And examples include the text, Scaurus's finest mackerel sauce from Scaurus's workshop, or the somewhat over-emphatic, best, finest mackerel sauce from the workshop of Aulus Umbricius Abscantus, in other words, a workshop managed by one of the family's freedmen or former slaves. But the connection to the Umbrici Scari is also demonstrated by mosaics found in their house. Now, more usually, when we see mosaics, we associate them with pretty pictures like mythological scenes. But in fact, in this instance, we have some highly unusual examples of mosaics associated with the commercial interests of the householder. Here we have in the atrium of the house of Umbricius Scaurus the usual layout of the pool in the middle, the impluvium, and at each of the corners is a mosaic depicting a fish sauce container. And these mosaics also then have the imitations of the painted labels. So we read Scaurus's finest mackerel sauce from Scaurus's workshop, finest fish puree, Scaurus's finest mackerel sauce, the best fish puree from Scaurus's workshop. So here we have a really good example of art literally imitating reality. And this rather idiosyncratic taste in domestic decor on the part of Umbricius Scaurus definitely illustrates, I think, his pride in the fact that he came to dominate the market for fish sauce in the Bay of Naples area. We can only imagine his devastation when his adult son predeceased him, but he must have taken some consolation from the honours given to him by the town council. Now, my final example is drawn from the very latest discoveries at Pompeii. So even though the excavations have been going on since the 18th century, there's still a significant area of the site that is still to be uncovered. And what I'm going to show you is a monumental tomb to the south of the town outside the Stabian Gate, which had been uncovered towards the end of the 19th century, but was covered over by a building being put on top, and it's now re-emerged. Unfortunately, the epitaph itself is missing from the tomb, so we don't know for certain who was buried there, although I will give you a best guess at the end. But it is the longest known inscription so far discovered at Pompeii, and it reveals many details about the sensational life story of this individual. Indeed, the inscription actually appears to recall the praise speech, the eulogium, delivered at his funeral. And what I'm going to do is to give you a preview of some of my ideas on this new material, which I haven't yet published. So the tomb was only discovered in 2017, and it was discovered outside the area of the Stabian Gate, indicated by the red arrow, near some other prestigious tombs of the town. For instance, Marcus Tullius had founded the Temple of Augustan Fortune in Pompeii. As I mentioned earlier, it had already been damaged by earlier work when building was put on top of it in the 19th century, so parts of the upper tomb structure are missing. However, what we do have is this lengthy dedicatory inscription, as I say, a sort of echo of the speech made in his honour at his death, which doesn't actually name the deceased, but continues on this man. So clearly it's continuing a story that started elsewhere on the tomb. It's beautifully engraved, and it records benefactions made by this individual to Pompeii, including gladiatorial shows, banquets, distribution of cash, and handouts of bread and grain. And it's totally exceptional in its scale and combination of gifts. Now, there's a debate over exactly what the Latin means in some places, but what's interesting is the way in which his gifts to the town are set within the context of his life story. So we start by talking of a banquet given when he assumed his adult toga. So this was the coming of age ceremony when he was aged only 14 or 15. And the size of the banquet is totally extraordinary and unparalleled. A quick bit of maths, 456 times 15 gives you no fewer than 6,840 individuals being wined and dined at his expense at Pompeii. It's unclear whether these diners are just the adult male citizens of the town or whether it included women or even children. It's relevant to estimates of the population of Pompeii because if it's only adult males, then we could say, so we have 6,840 adult males, same number of women, same number of children, plus probably a third of the population were slaves, which would actually give us an extraordinary population for Pompeii of 30,000, which is much, much higher than any of the textbooks that you'll read at the moment. So it's possible that the 30,000 is not just the people living literally in the walls of Pompeii, but also from the surrounding countryside. But whatever the proportion of the total population being accommodated for the feast, it must have been a high-profile public event. Yeah, I ask you, where could you actually put up 456 dining couches in the city of Pompeii? Was it in a single location? Was it in multiple locations? It's certainly not possible that this took place in a house, so it must have been in an area of public space requiring the permission of the town council. Was it in the Forum? Was it in the Grand Palaestra? Was it in the Triangular Forum? Wherever it was, it must have been an event that took over the town for the day. And one thing that nobody else has wondered about, but I wonder about, is where on earth did they cook all that food to serve 6,000, 7,000 people? The second thing that we hear about this individual is that he gave a gladiatorial show. And this was that it was on an unprecedented scale, more like games at Rome than the usual number of gladiators shown at Pompeii. So at Pompeii, the maximum known number of gladiators in any particular games are 35 pairs of gladiators. He boasts that he has owned 416 gladiators in his training school. He doesn't actually say how many gladiators competed in his games, but clearly we're to expect that significant numbers then took part in his fights. So the deceased is claiming that he was acting on an unprecedented scale in paying for gladiators to perform at Pompeii. In addition to putting on gladiatorial combat, he also fed the people of Pompeii in time of a food shortage. Again, this is something completely unheard of before this text, via the distribution of grain and baked bread. He sold grain at a subsidized price, but even then not everyone could afford it, so he made a distribution of free loaves of bread. And this is where a long-known painting actually now seems possibly to be a direct allusion to this particular event. Here we have someone in a toga handing out a distribution of loaves. So this is actually quite possible that this is the event that we now have recorded on this tombstone. He also talks about having put on a gladiatorial show before the resolution of the Senate. And this is useful because it gives us a chronological point in his career. When it talks about before the senatorial decree, this is the decree that was notorious, banning gladiators from being performed at Pompeii after there was a huge riot in AD 59, when fighting broke out not just in the arena, but among the spectators, with the people of Pompeii beating up the people of Nuceria from a nearby rival town. Tacitus tells us about this event in Annals 14, and he underlines the seriousness of the occasion, which prompted the Roman Senate to intervene directly in the affairs of Italian towns. The Pompeians, however, don't seem to care that they've been punished, and instead they set up this painting celebrating the riot in the amphitheatre. Here you can see you've got a depiction of the amphitheatre, identifiable as being Pompeii's amphitheatre, with fighting in the streets as well as in the arena. The next sentence of the inscription emphasizes the individual privilege granted to our deceased by the emperor himself. This is probably the Emperor Nero, no less. It's either in the context of a privilege to bring back his gladiators to Pompeii, even though they've been banned by the Senate, or it might be explained in the context of the food shortage, which I mentioned earlier, when it's possible that gladiators may have been removed from the whole of Italy in an attempt to reserve food supplies only for the deserving citizens of Italy. He then moves on to another act of generosity, namely distribution of cash to different parts of society to celebrate the occasion of his wedding. And he ends by mentioning 2 further shows paid for before he died. The final part of the inscription as preserved contains an unprecedented detail that the people wanted him to be elected as town patron, but he turned down the invitation. No other example is known in the Roman world of a local notable advertising the fact that he's turned down the chance to become the town's patron. The inscription emphasizes the consensus of the townsfolk, and it's entirely possible, I think, that we should imagine the people shouting out their support for him in the amphitheatre at some of the games that he was putting on for them. But just when the town council was on the point of co-opting him, he stepped in and said, no, this is too much, I don't want to do this. You can't really imagine any of our modern day politicians turning down the chance to become top dog. So this is an important detail, because overall, I think what we have here is an individual who's acting as if he is the miniature emperor of Pompeii, doing all the things that emperors were expected to do, putting on gladiator shows, distributing food and money, but also, crucially, turning down a public position. Our Pompeian is acting just like the Emperor Augustus. So the key question remains, just who is he? Well, it's unfortunate, of course, that the key part of the epitaph naming him just doesn't survive. But the best guess is that he is an individual called Gnaeus Aulus Nigidius Maius, who's known to have been a prominent local magistrate. He's known to have been a lavish giver of games, and he's even hailed as Princeps Colonii, Emperor of the Colony, and Princeps Munerarium, Emperor of the Games Givers. And this seems particularly appropriate for the miniature emperor of Pompeii. It also fits with other evidence that Aulus Nigidius Maius owned a gladiatorial troupe. Here we have a games advert in big, large red lettering outside the main entrance to the gladiatorial barracks on the external wall of the large theatre. So sometimes when you put all the pieces of the jigsaw together, you find that you don't have a single jigsaw, you have lots of different jigsaws. In this case, I think we can suggest fairly confidently that this is the individual who's acting as the miniature emperor of Pompeii. So overall, what I hope to have done is to show you some of the ways in which we can repopulate the town of Pompeii with its real inhabitants and their life stories. Inscriptions don't give us objective assessments of these individuals and their contributions to the town, but instead they show us how they themselves wanted to be remembered. From inscriptions, we can get intriguing glimpses of the personalities of individuals like Holconius Rufus, the ambitious politician, Eumachia, a mother using her wealth to promote the advancement of her son, Umbricius Scaurus, the canny businessman, and finally, the new story of the anonymous individual, possibly Aulus Nigidius Maius, who surpassed all other public figures at Pompeii in the generosity of his gifts to the town, even to the extent of being hailed as Princeps Colonii, the emperor of the colony. Thank you.